MicroProd is a research project which is funded by the Horizon 2020 program of the European Commission with the goal of a better understanding the slowdown of productivity through a micro-funded perspective, hence the acronym. MicroProd is articulated in a number of research areas which study the relation with productivity, between productivity and globalization, innovation, intangible financial frictions, and labor markets. And as MicroProd is contributing to funding ERWIT, among all those papers that have been selected for this year's ERWIT, we have identified 3 that address a topic particularly fitting with the research objectives of MicroProd. So we have decided to have a dedicated so-called MicroProd session. And the 3 papers are the one of Gabor Bekes, which we are about to hear, on small and medium-sized enterprises and global value chains. The one of Agnès Benassi-Querret will be presenting tomorrow on financial crisis and total factor productivity. And the one of Francis Cremars, who will be presenting on Friday on firm-to-firm trade and the labor market. So today we have Gabor presenting, and the paper is Can My SME Join Your Global Value Chain, your GVC? I guess we have to read in this way. Measuring and explaining the nature of buyer-supplier relationships across firms. So Gabor, the usual rules, 20 minutes presentation and then 10 minutes question. I will waive when you are 5 minutes to your 20 minutes. Okay, Gabor, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Carlo, and Beata. Thanks for organizing this. It's great to see some of you, at least some of you in pictures and some of you in the audience. So this paper is joined with Miklós Korán, who's here, and Balázs Muratközi and Álmos Teregdi. And what we are trying to do is think about global value chains and think about the relationship between firms participating in these value chains and trying to understand more about the relationship that can happen between 2 firms that are in global value chains. Obviously, in this audience, I'm not going to talk about why global value chains are an important issue when you think about firm performance and when you think about development or when you think about trade. But what I want to talk about instead is that while we know quite a bit about how these global value chains are organized and how how the network could be and what kind of firms participate, we know much less about the relationship. We know much less about the governance modes of relationships. And what we're going to argue in this paper is that there are different ways how firms may cooperate and how relationships may evolve. And one will be vertical integration, another will be market-like transactions when firms do not have too much apart from the transaction that they do. And we're going to talk about cooperative or relational transactions when firms actually do something together and cooperate. Now, policies, this question is not only interesting from kind of theoretical or empirical point of view, but policies are often thinking about how can we help our small and medium-sized enterprises to become part of global value chains. And there are a bunch of policies that are aimed to this, and what we're going to argue is that it's not enough to be part of value chains. It's important actually to cooperate with your partners. Now, when you think about governance structures, and I'm going to be pretty brief as many others in these 20 minutes about literature, but when you think about the governance structure or think about collaboration in global value chains, you typically think about vertical integration or outsourcing, right? You typically think about kind of buy rather than make decisions. And so what we're going to talk about is how we can get further and how can we think about, so what's in between, what kind of relationships are there between these 2 extremes of buy and make. And so, we are building on existing literature that are talking about a lot of potential relationships, and we kind of compress it into 3, and I'm going to talk about more of these 3 types of relationships. But before I do, let me just say, so when we think about defining our types of relationships in between firms in a global value chain, we want to think about, so how complex is a transaction? How codifiable are what you produce? Are you producing something simple that can be written down, that I need a 1 meter long of steel tube, or are you producing something that is harder to describe and that needs continuous development? How we think about technological complexity, the knowledge that are embodied in these producers, and these are going to be the questions that determine, whether we are thinking about a market-based, a relational, or more kind of a hierarchical relationship between firms. Now, how do we do that? I'm going to talk a little bit more about the details, but let me just introduce the main one of the main things that we have done. We've done a survey of about 1,500 firms that are located in 3 Eastern European countries. And we basically asked them, so what are your relationship between your partners, your buyers and your suppliers? And then we linked this to Orbis. And we could understand how the firms that we observed, how their buyer portfolio, how the supplier portfolio, and how the relationships with key buyers look like. So we are going to base our distinction of potential relationship between firms on this questionnaire and on the questions that firms replied, how they cooperate and what kind of relationships they have with their buyers. And what we want to do in this work is basically figuring out how important, how prevalent these potential relationships are. What are the factors that kind of help firms decide which way to go with these relationships, and how are having sort of market type relational or vertically integrated relationship relate to firm performance. And obviously, this is kind of an exploratory paper. We are not going to have, hundreds of thousands of firms that some of you had in your papers, and this is a cross-sectional survey. So what we can do is look at some interesting patterns and try to understand, patterns and behaviors that happening within global value chains. So, just to give you some results, if you need to go for lunch or dinner pretty soon. So first, we found that about 75% of transactions that happening between supply chains are not market-based. So there is a lot of room for cooperation or vertical integration. And in particular, we found that when you look at firms that are in a business group, about 30–40% of their sales happen within the business group. We found that the choice of relationship depends on both kind of the industry firms are in and supplier and buyer characteristics. And we also found that firms that have more relationships that are based on cooperation and the strong relationships with their buyer tend to be larger, more productive, and most importantly, they also tend to grow faster in the future. We also found that a TFP premium that is related to having relational partners is comparable or even larger to the export premium. Now let me go a bit more detail into what we have done. So we did a survey to understand the relationship between customers and suppliers, and you can look at the presentation for more details and descriptive statistics that I'm not going to share in this 20 minutes. But we looked at firms that are medium and large in Hungarian, Romanian, and in Slovakia. Basically, they are firms that are concentrated in a couple of industries: cars, electronics, chemicals, machinery. So we disregarded, light industries and services completely. So we wanted to have, sectors where global value chains are prevalent. So whatever we say is relevant to these industries and not the whole economy. We started the project, 5 years ago, and the survey was in 2016 and 17. We meshed it with Orbis recently, so we can talk about future development of these firms for whom we observed the pattern. So we are going to have two types of variables in everything that I'm going to show you. You're going to have respondent level variables. So this is about the firms that we survey, location, main activity, and we're going to have and some financial variables, and we're going to have relationship specific variables, right, that are related to the firm that we observe and their partner, right? So and most importantly, we asked our respondent that could you tell us who are the most important buyers? Anybody who has at least 10% of of your share in sales, or anybody else who may be important for other reasons. So typically, we would have 2 to 5 partners per firms. Every firm has given at least one partner. Right? Some of the firms have a single buyer or a single important buyers. Many firms have more, and they've provided information about their buyers. And we use that information on the buyers, linked it with Orbis to learn about characteristics of the buyer firms, right? And we have just a bit more than 3,060 supplier-buyer relationship, right? So we have 1,500 firms. On average, they have a bit more than 2 partners. So we have 3,600 supplier-buyer relationships. And we linked it to Orbis. It was difficult. And so let me if there are questions, I can talk about it, obviously. So let me tell you how we defined different relationships. So the first was basically we wanted to define whether a relationship is market or relational based on how firms cooperate. So, for example, we didn't use length of the relationship. We didn't use size of the relationship. We looked at what's going on between these two firms, and we used 3 questions in our survey to determine whether a relationship is a relational or cooperational one or a purely market-based. And basically, these questions are about: am I producing something specific to the buyer, or even more, has the buyer kind of made me do a modification to meet their criteria, right? It could have happened in the beginning of my relationship. It could have happened at the end. But did I make a change in what I'm doing, in the product that I'm doing for my buyers, right? It could have been easy, it could have been hard, but did I have to make something innovative for my buyers? And you can see that actually, this is quite prevalent. 41% have a partner-specific product, and 20 and 30% of firms did some innovation, product or process, when they started or recently. And these questions are related to CIS. They are related to a feature survey that we've done earlier. So we try to have a definition that relates to other surveys that are available. Now, based on this, we are going to have 3 categories, and this is one of the message that I'm trying to convey today, is that when you look at the relationship between buyers and sellers in a supply chains, you can think about 3 relationships. You can think about vertical relationship when the seller and the buyer are in the same business group, right? So how can they be in the same business group? Well, it's possible that the buyer is the head of the group and they're buying from their affiliate. The other way is also possible. You have a Hungarian firm that has an affiliate in Russia, and they are actually selling to their affiliate, who will then market in Russia. And it's also possible that they are part of a large business group, right? There's a head of group somewhere out there, and they are both just part of the group, but not necessarily directly owning one or the other. So that's vertical integration. Firms that are part of the same group, they can be both domestic, one can be foreign, but they are part of the same group. So there is some vertical integration there. The second is relational, when the buyer and the seller are not in the same group, but they cooperate, right? They are cooperating because they're producing a product that is specific to the buyer. They're cooperating because they made modifications to their production or their processes to meet the buyer's requirement. And then the third is market-based, when there is no vertical integration and there is no cooperation. Right. So these are the three. These are the three categories. And once again, you know, all of these relationships can be pretty recent. It's possible that they have acquired the affiliate fairly recently. It's possible that, you know, the relationship is going on for a short period of time, but it's also possible that it's going on for a long time. And we observe market-based relationship, and there is no activity between the buyer and the seller still going on for, you know, a decade. So let me just give you first describing the prevalence of this, and that goes back to the first point I made as a takeaway. So when you look at the share of these relationships, you can see that about half of the relationships are relational, 14% vertical integration when you have business groups, and 35% market-based. But of course, relational and vertical integration transactions are much larger, right? So when you look at values transaction, you know, sales values, you can see that market-based is only 25% of what we see. And you can see that vertical integration, that is sales within, you know, sales between firms that are in the same business group, are 43%. And so, you know, you can see that there are large numbers. Now, of course, it's possible that we have some bias here, but in terms of ballparks, they are fairly important. So, you know, if you just want to compare these three relationships, you can see that in terms of length of relationships, there is some difference, but it's not huge. Right? Obviously, we do not observe small transactions, right? We ask the firms, what are your three most important relationships? What are your, you know, partners that buy at least 10% of your group? So we don't observe small ones, right? So small ones may indeed be market-based, right? So there may be a bias over here, but, you know, whatever we observe, we don't see a huge difference. We see a difference in terms of vertical integration, sales that happen within in a business group being larger. And we also see that when you look at the share of export activity here, you can see that relational is more important and vertical integration is more important. When you look at foreign firms, the share of foreign firms in these transactions, you can again see relational being more important and vertical integration being even more important, right? So when you think about these relationships, it's not really the length, right? But it's the quality of the relationship. And you can see that when you look at export transactions, relational and vertical integration are more important. When you think about foreign firms in these countries, they tend to be also relying more on relational or vertical transactions in the business group. So let me tell you a bit more about what kind of firms go into relational transactions. And I'm going to compare market-based and relational and market-based versus deals that happen in business groups. And so one thing that is important is distance. And I'm not going to talk about more, but kind of we are looking at kind of firm, you know, where countries are, where firms are, and clearly, you know, when you look at firms that are further apart, contractual incompleteness, communication costs, that means that relational transactions and, you know, transactions within business groups are more important. I'm just going to look at an export dummy today. Size and length of transactions, they also tend to slightly move towards relational vertical integrations, and also number of buyers, ownership, industries, that sort of things can all matter. I'm going to show you a simple linear probability model where the market is the base, and I'm just going to compare I'm just going to talk about column 1, and I'm going to compare firms that are market-based and firms that are relational. And we can see that export sales are more important in a relational setup. We can see that domestic groups tend to use interestingly, more market-based solutions, we can see, interestingly, that if you have only very few buyers, it does not mean that you have a relational cooperation with them. It's actually, you typically firms that have more buyers are the ones that are able to have the capacity to build these relational aspects. And when you look at industries, we can see that in auto and vehicles and equipment and electronics industries that are typically associated with more complicated products, where that are harder to contract, maybe you see more relational and more vertical integration, while as market-based relationship is more prevalent in sort of simpler products. The final point I want to make is we want to look at, so it's fine that you can see these relationships, and they're clearly important to talk about non-market relationships in global value chains, and that's important for policy. But so how are these relationships related to outcomes that we care about, right? How is it related to the size of the companies, the productivity, and importantly, their future growth? So I'm just going to show you simple OLS regressions. These are what I'm going to show you are at the level of the firm. So we are kind of looking at averages on their buyer portfolios, right? So whatever I show you is going to be OLS regressions that are weighted by the share of the size of the transactions with each of the partners. And I'm going to first talk about the size of the company. Then I'm going to talk about TFP, and TFP are measured basically using the whole orbis, not just the data that we have, and then we use coefficients to calculate TFP for our variables. We're going to have industry controls weighted by relative share of transactions, and I'm going to drop a few observations that where the relationships are just too small for the firms. And when I talk about the growth rate, I'm going to talk about future growth rate, right? So our survey is using 2015 data. It took place in 2016, and we asked about the last year. So the cross section is of financials is 2015, but because of our data, we could look at growth rates, average annual growth rate 3 years in the future, right? And so that's going to be the third right-hand side variable. Right, so we have log sales as a measure of size, we have TFP, and we have future growth rate, right? And what we can see is that, well, both relational and being vertically integrated, they are positively correlated with size and importantly with TFP. So when you look at firms, when you compare firms that have all their relationships in this relational way, in a cooperative manner, they tend to be 23% more productive than firms who only have market-based relationships. And basically firms tend to be, by the way, between, typically concentrated in these two groups. And you can see when you compare firms with, again, partners that are on a relationship basis, they tend to go 10% faster than those who don't. And 10% growth is really a lot. The average growth rate in our sample is about 4% per year. So this means that the growth is coming from firms that are in this relationship. And basically, once we add all the controls that we looked at, the relationship still stands. And I just want to point out before I conclude that this 23% productivity premium is larger than what we see on the exporter side. And when we compare firms that are similar in terms of where they are in the value chains, in terms of being in groups, being on the export side, having foreign owners, having longer or shorter relationships, we see basically very similar numbers that I've just shown you. So as I finish my 20 minutes marathon, let me just give you a bit of a summary. So what we see, I mean, our intention was to look at what's going on in a supply chain, and rather than just looking at a network, understand how governance in business groups in global value chains are solved. And we argue that there are many ways you can have a plain market relationship, even if it goes for long, but without cooperation. We can have a relational transaction where the buyer and the seller collaborate, and the buyer makes products that are specific to the buyer. And you can have vertical integrations, and we show that they all happen to be pretty important. And non-market solutions are 3/4 of the game. And we also shown that the sales that happen within business groups in these countries, in these industries, are actually very large. And that goes, against some findings that are in the literature. Having partners that are more on the relational side or more on the vertical integration side are positively correlated with size, productivity, and future growth rate. So when you think about global value chains, it's important to think about relationships, and we see that they are not random. Certain firms are more likely to build stronger relationships or even integrate vertically, and we see that these relationships then tend to turn into larger size, more productivity, and higher future growth. And this is where I stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabor. Thanks. Very interesting. We have a question from Dalia Marin. She's asking whether you know why the growth rate seems to be affected only by the relational type of firms and not the vertical integration type of firm, whether you suspect anything. You prefer to have one question at a time, or yeah?
Yes, I think so. That, I mean, this okay. I can answer easily. So I mean, here I would say basically, it's stargazing. The coefficients are comparable. We have much fewer firms that are in business groups that are, that are not. So I would kind of say we cannot say that these two numbers are different. It's just for vertically integrated, it's less precisely measured.
Giuseppe Berlingeri is asking whether you ask when the relationship is formed, because he's wondering whether there is a life cycle of the relationship going from relational to vertical integration, which might also explain the growth rate. I presume that if the relation brings a positive growth rate, then the company gets integrated in the business group. That's yeah.
So we asked how long this relationship is going on. So the length of the relationship is exactly for how long the buyer has been buying the product from the supplier. And while this clearly is important, and you can look at the productivity relationship in the second column here. So the length is really important. The longer it goes, the more likely, the higher the premium. It's also related to the selection. The longer it goes, the more likely it becomes relational. The more likely, vertical relationships have been going on longer. But even once you control for this, we still have the importance of the relationship. So it's not just the length.
Okay. Dalia is asking whether if you can say something about the governance is affecting the relationship in the current situation, whether the current stress in the market, whether you have observed any change in the relationship, although I think your data go back in the past, so you do not observe.
Yeah, and yes, unfortunately. So this is this survey we did again a couple of years ago, and it was pretty costly, and so we don't know what's going on now. But if anybody is interested to finance a second round, I think Miklos is and me, we are happy to collaborate and repeat it. It would be, I think, super interesting to see, especially these days, how it changed. But that's like the happy mid-teens.
Okay, and if there are no other questions, I have one question. If I can abuse of my role of chair. No, it's related to the vertically integrated. So essentially, you find that there's a lot of transactions going on within business groups. So 40-something%, if I remember correctly. Yes, and this seems to be at odds with reference to other papers that in the US have looked at intra-firm relationship, and that they find that, at least from the trade part, there is very little intra-group trade, or whatever comes from intra-group trade is super granularly concentrated in very few large groups that trade a lot, and most of the firms don't trade. So one question is whether you observe the same pattern, whether this 43% on average is the outcome of a very dispersed distribution, or whether this is a consistent feature across all the business groups. And the second question is whether the remaining transactions, so the 57% that are not vertically integrated, whether they have some different characteristics or than the other firms. Is this a sample of some self-selected firms, or the remaining transaction remain market-based, or maybe relational, so something? That's the second question.
Okay, so thanks for asking this. This is actually one of the pretty much most unexpected finding that we have, and I didn't want to push it too hard today, but so we have pretty strong evidence that compared to what was found in the US, which is like a couple of percent at best, but pretty small, this is not what's happening here. There is a lot of transaction. It's not concentrated in any way. So we have a slide which I didn't talk about, but we can, because we do not observe all the transactions, so we can take different assumptions about those that we don't observe. So kind of the lower bound is 23-28% of what we observe, and the upper bound is even higher. And the fact that when you look at the simple share, right, you still see 33%, and then when you weight by sales, you get 43%. It tells you, yes, there is some size effect and distributions, but even just at the count of relationship, it's pretty prevalent, right? It's not just a few big ones. It's happening now. What I can say compared to the paper in the US is that, or the evidence in the US is that the difference here is that we see obviously a strong role of foreign groups, right? So there is a lot of multinationals operating in these countries. And we also see that a large share of within business group transactions are exports. So this 43% that I told you about, when you look at only domestic trade, it would be closer to 20, and it's 60 when you look at exports. So the fact that we can observe, mostly within Europe, right? So compared to the US, this wouldn't be export, but still, export transactions, that's certainly part of the story. Another part is when you look at foreign firms, but even when you look at domestic to domestic, within domestic groups that are not very large in these countries. So even when you look at that, it's still about 10%. So it's still more, and that's like the smallest and least important transactions. And your second question. So it's the selection is there in the sense that we do not observe small transactions. Right, so we see about 60% of transactions of firms on average. For some firms, we see all of them. For some, or at least 80-90%. For some, we see smaller ones. So clearly, there, in terms of prevalence, in terms of these numbers, the market-based in terms of count is certainly larger. They're typically smaller, so in terms of values, we capture a larger share.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Gabor.